just like humans have a moral relationship with each other, they have a moral relationship with nature. That we come out of nature, we are connected to nature, and we become very disconnected, as you pointed out, rightfully so. And if we get reconnected, we can have a healthier nature along with healthy human beings. It doesn't have to be one or the other.
You know, you can't be for capitalism and for preserving the environment. Obviously, those are just absolutely contradictory things that cannot happen. Ed Warner is with an organization called the Sand County Foundation, and I'm right, correct? There is no way capitalism and protecting, conserving the environment could ever work together. They are polar opposites.
Au contraire, John. In fact, there's an enormous dichotomy in this country between two movements that love nature. One we call the environmental movement, the other one we call conservation. And I need to explain that the environmental movement, starting with John Muir's philosophy and the Sierra Club, were anti-humanist. John Muir came from a religious background.
Who is John Muir?
John Muir was a Scotsman who emigrated to the U.S., ended up in California, and became advocate for what became Yosemite National Park. He's a marvelous man with a great mind, only what he did was he took a religious belief that said man has dominion over nature and we can do anything we want with it, including destroying it, for the benefit of individuals or larger groups of men. And he flip-flopped, where he said, that's not right. But he kept that non-rational belief, which is man is the enemy of wilderness. And then he formed the Sierra Club, an organization certain of us love to hate. And they said business, corporate, capitalism is the enemy of the environment.
Well, then help me out, because right now, everyone is an environmentalist. It's taught in the schools, it's taught everywhere. You are very careful to say that your work is a conservationist. I need a distinction between the two.
Mm-hmm. The second father of the environmental movement, as it was called back then, was a guy by the name of Aldo Leopold, who was born in northern Iowa to a non-religious family who actually promoted scientific thinking. And Aldo went to work for the U.S. Forest Service. He was a scientist, what we would call an ecologist today, but that was before that name had even been invented. And he recognized some very interesting things, like there are no forests that are wildernesses. They've all been managed for thousands of years, first by Native Americans, and then by Western-type immigrants. And so Muir was wrong to begin with. He thought that this was wilderness, and everywhere you go, you find evidence of humans interacting with the environment. Whether they do it destructively or constructively maybe becomes the issue. So Aldo, who grew up very close to where John Muir lived, Portage, Wisconsin, and Aldo moved back to Baraboo, Wisconsin, 5 miles apart. And he became the first professor of ecology in the history of the world. He was funded, the endowed chair, by an industrialist, a capitalist. How could an environmentalist like Aldo Leopold be best friends with a capitalist? Because Leopold understood that if you incentivize private landowners who controlled most of the wildlife land on ranches and farms and in timber to do better by the environment itself, nature itself, would do better by them. This is a capitalist approach.
Okay, let me pull back for a little bit. First of all, let's talk about you for just a second. You are a rabid conservationist. I mean, you have put your money into conservation. You have made it your passion, and you don't need to do this. You could probably do anything else you wanted. Why is conservation? Why is it something you care about, just on a personal level? And then let's go into the politics.
I was raised in New York City. My dad had a small business. They wanted to get rid of me for the summer when I was 10 years old because I was too much trouble. Nobody wanted me. They sent me to the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. It was a famous theater camp.
Yeah.
My God, when I was 14, my counselor was Francis Ford Coppola, for goodness sake.
You're kidding me.
I knew Broadway people, and I learned acting, which is why I can do what we're doing right now, but I fell in love with nature. I decided that I would be my own boss. I would walk around the countryside. It was almost like a John Muir kind of experience, or an Aldo experience, where I fell in love. And I wanted to be a scientist working in nature. It just so happened that I loved rocks even more than wildflowers. I became a geologist. I was anti-authority. I worked for 2 giant corporations, and I made them fortunes, and there was no career for me at all. I mean, I knew that my independent attitude didn't work. So I became my own boss. And there I am, I'm running giant drilling operations in western Wyoming.
I knew you hated the land. I knew you weren't a real conservationist. You were pillaging the land.
I was, and the proof of it is, if you looked in my day pack, which I carried everywhere with me, you would have found a Peterson bird book, and an Audubon flower book, and a book on Rocky Mountain trees. And I didn't like drilling rigs. They blow up and they kill people. I didn't spend my time on drilling rigs unless I had a job to do. I was off wandering around the countryside. And what did I discover? Most of the beautiful land was owned by private individuals. And I would go up to their door and knock on it and say, "May I travel across your land?" And in the 60s and early 70s, they said, "Oh, sure, just leave the gates the way you found them." And then something shifted completely. And all of a sudden, I was faced off with a woman with a 12-gauge shotgun across her arm saying, "You don't work for the government, do you?" It's a good thing I didn't. I found that private landowners were terrified of some new environmental laws that could destroy their ranches and their farms and take their property rights away from it. It was called the Endangered Species Act. I learned the law of unintended negative consequences from that. It's not like the law didn't have good intentions. It was written badly, and it was managed and regulated even worse by government agencies. And it terrified private landowners that they could lose their property rights without any recourse whatsoever. And so in Wyoming, the unintended consequence was the 3 S's. You know about the 3 S's?
Oh, I know it. Let me take a shot at this one. Shoot, shovel, and shut up.
Here were people who had lived generations on the land. They had taken care of the wildlife, make sure they have water, they make sure they had grass or forbs to eat, and now they were the enemy of the environmental movement, and they reacted negatively. Duh. If you demonize somebody, you think they're going to be nice to you in return? I was made the enemy of the environment, and nobody loves nature any more than I do.
There's this idea that private ownership is a destructive force and government ownership is a beautiful thing, that it is better cared for. And this is not my area of expertise, but I've seen the maps, I've seen the photographs of privately owned forest land where timber is grown, a renewable resource. And I've seen the National Forest Service where it's not. And when you take a look at the line, you see a healthy forest over here, which is owned, and the collectively owned forest is full of deadwood and beetle kill and all this other terrible stuff because, well, there's no way to make money cleaning all that stuff up, so we just hope that the Forest Service does it. It seems to me when you own something, you take care of it better. In economics, we call it the tragedy of the commons, which is if everybody owns something, well, nobody's there to take care of it. But if this is my home or my yard or my car, I'm going to take extra care of it because it's in my self-interest to make sure this does well. You're telling me the same thing happens on land. And let me push you on that. The farmer has to work the land. He wants to remove the rocks, remove what's growing there, put in soybeans, or in the next year maybe alfalfa. That doesn't seem like conservation, is it?
Here's how it works. If you are an ecologically minded farmer or rancher, you're going to improve the land because you know that the old practices, whether it was overgrazing by cattle or horses or overplowing and just using synthetic fertilizers to keep the damn land productive as the soil was dying, was short term. And if you own the land, you think long term. The people I work with are not thinking for themselves for the next 5 years to sell out to developers. They're thinking of their children and their grandchildren. That's what they want to preserve. And I know ranchers who've been on the land for 5 and 6 generations, and farmers. And so they think of new ways to be more like nature while they produce even more crops. So we've gone to things like no-till instead of plowing the land, or cover crops, which put fiber and nitrogen back in the soil. And if you want to get carbon out of the atmosphere, you don't want to have an industrial plant taking it out of the air. It's ridiculously non-economical to do that. But if you do better soil practices and you go from a depleted soil, it's down to 1% carbon, and you raise it to 2% carbon, you've taken more carbon out of the atmosphere than you could ever do by government regulation. Right. And when you do that, you get better water infiltration, you get a better root zones, you get better crops. So if you act like nature and you take care of it, it takes care of you. And that's Aldo Leopold's land ethic.
When our country was founded, 80 to 90% of the population worked the land, worked in agriculture, ranching, because we needed to eat. I believe that's down to like 2% of the population, 1% of the population works in agriculture, because we've got machines, beautiful machines, and we've got systems that can harvest. And so we are disconnected from that. It sounds to me like, I've got a lot of friends who are hunters. I have never found people who care more about the land than hunters. And I know hunters get this bad rap because they kill animals, but they do a lot of incredible work killing the right animals when they're overproduced. So they love it. They love the land, but people think they don't. And since nobody hunts anymore, it's hard to get. And since people don't work the land, my guess is the type of message you're trying to get out with the Sound County Foundation has the same problem. I know nothing about working the land.
It's an interesting issue. And yes, I think we're down to less than 1% of people living on the land. So the environmental advocates tell you that we should have all small local farms selling us vegetables. And yet, the irony is that if you look at third world subsistence farming, it's much worse than CO2 in the atmosphere. It's terraforming. It's destroying nature on farms that have very, very low productivity. And so the environmental movement, again, gets it upside down. We should be promoting industrial farming in places that have lands that are potentially good for wildlife. Let me do the math. Zimbabwe, where I worked for a long time, they had cattle ranches that couldn't earn a living, large scale. We're talking about millions of acres. And they had laws that allowed them to convert from cattle raising to wildlife. And here's the economics. It's very straightforward. They were raising cattle and making 50 cents an acre income, gross. If you had wildlife and you just shot them and ate them, it would be about $1 an acre.
How did they get the $1 an acre shooting wildlife?
Oh, because they do it there, and they have economists that study it.
What do you mean? So that I own this acre of land in Zimbabwe. I could either ranch it, raise a cow, I get that, harvest the cow, get that, sell the cow, get the money. How do I make money if I just let wild animals live on the land?
Because they had the best darn law governing wildlife that was ever created. In our country, the king owns the wildlife. It comes from English law, and now the states, the game and fish, own the wildlife. Even if you have wildlife on your private land, you can't just shoot it. You can't even issue a permit for somebody to come and hunt on it. Oh no, it's controlled by the government. But in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, they agreed that they operated under the old English law of Rex Nullius. Rex, the king, Nullius, nobody. Nobody owns the wildlife. It released the economic benefits of wildlife to private landowners. They had a free system of buying and selling animals. So if you raised too many kudu on your land, you didn't have to kill them. You could sell them, make a lot of money. You could shoot them and eat them, make a lot of money. You could hunt them for trophies, make even more money. Or you could have photo safari business and make even more money. And the economics of a marketplace that's free to operate was $0.50 per acre for cows, $1 an acre if you ate the animals, about $2 an acre if you sold them, $4 an acre if you had trophy hunting. An elephant trophy hunt's $100,000. Yeah.
All right.
You put a whole
Let me explain why you're evil. Let me explain why you're wrong on this. Because we are living on land that was kind of sort of like that. We had buffalo here. That, I think about people, you damn conservationists. Well, we just want to get back to the way nature was. Well, we couldn't drive a car because there'd be stampedes every other day that would destroy our cities. So people came and they killed the buffalo for sport, for meat, for trophies, and now they're gone. That's what you're proposing, because that property, birds fly over, but they don't stay there. Migrating species go through it. So if I just open it up and let people kill those animals, I don't have to worry about where they're going, because that's not my land back there. I only have to worry about this. I'm going to kill all the buffalo before they go to my neighbor and he hunts them to death. This is an unworkable system.
That's an unsustainable system you described. And so since you are a landowner who loves the land and the wildlife and would like to make a living, you make it sustainable. So can I give you some numbers?
I won't believe them.
Save Valley Conservancy, 966,000 acres.
Where is this?
In Zimbabwe.
Okay.
Southeastern Zimbabwe, just about on the Mozambique border.
You mean the acreage again?
966,000 acres.
Huge.
Originally 24 cattle ranches, subdivided into 30,000 acre lots. Now 18 owners, no fences. They took all the fences down, they sold all the cattle off, put an electrified game fence around the whole 1,000,000 acres. Then they bought wildlife from other people who were allowed to sell it to them. So they bought kudu. They bought Cape buffalo. Kudu is the gorgeous antelope with the spiral horns. Yes. And eland, impala. They had leopards because you can't get rid of leopards. Leopards are like mountain lions. They're secretive. They hunt at night. But all the other animals had been killed off for the exactly what you described. Totally unsustainable to put cattle on there that couldn't survive on this semi-desert. So they got rid of that all, and they put animals that lived there naturally. They evolved there, so they do right well. Ecologists said it would take 50 years for the land to recover. It recovered in 10 years. It has tremendous resiliency. So they got 20 rhinos from the government who could not protect them on national parks. Why could the private landowners protect them? Because they put all that money back into armed guards and scouts. They had...
So poachers can't do it.
That's right. They kill the poachers. I'm sorry, but I bought the AR-15s for that operation. I'm a gun smuggler, but not really.
All right, so let me...
hold on. So see that, but if you have 800 kudu, you kill 20 a year. And 400 mommy kudus make another 300 kudus the next year. You actually have to control the populations at some point in time.
What about migrating species, though? For instance, and I've hunted some birds, and geese fly from country to country to country and then back again. Who owns them when they're in the sky? Which is one of the reasons why the United States and our neighbors have different treaties about how many you can kill and what the game limit should be, and if they're over or underpopulated. It's great to have this fenced-in yard. I got a fenced-in backyard. I'm happy to sell the rights to kill the rabbits and maybe even my dog, because I'm not a big fan of my dog. But for a migrating species, how do you manage something like that? Or do you? So when it flies over, do I own that bird?
It's a really good question. And the answer is probably not. Just like Kansas didn't own the air above it to prevent you from having a drink on a 707 back in 1963.
I remember.
I remember that too.
People would remember those
I was
little
underage
suitcases.
and I was drinking on that airplane. They took my drink away from me. I thought it was because they realized I was only 19.
Do you remember those little cases that, Schwab Playboy types were supposed to bring in that had 2 bottles and
So yeah, these are all technical issues and they need to be managed, just like geese have become like rats, because they're improperly managed.
Well, here, they're culling them in Denver. There's so many of them, they kill them and give them to poor people to eat, which is not a bad thing to do.
That's actually a terrific idea.
Right.
Here, as an example, even though you can control certain populations, like deer have become vermin. In my talks with environmental studies students, I ask my audience questions. I like to engage them, right? And I say a question like this: what is the most dangerous wild animal to human beings in North America? And the answer is the white-tailed deer. Kills more people in automobile wrecks, eats more crops, carries Lyme's disease, wasting disease. There's a new one out there I don't even know the name of yet. And that's not the worst. And the worst is what people don't see, because human beings see a snapshot of the world. I'm a geologist. I see everything in deep time, and I see through the structures. My mind is trained that way. White-tailed deer eat every single seedling in the forest from Minnesota to Maine. And that means that our forests, which are now about 250 years old, are going into old age, and they're going to die off to disease and destruction, and we're going to lose them because we're not managing the deer. So I came up with an idea 20 years ago, and I actually got thrown out of a room for this. I said, why don't we have commercial hunting of deer? We can put out very large permits and have private landowners kill hundreds and thousands and millions of deer and send them to processing plants and have the meat smoked. And then we can have the government buy up part of this with our tax dollars and take it over to Africa, where the forestry industry is opening up the forests and the subsistent hunters are killing all the game and smoking it. We could drown the game meat industry in Africa with we did it with corn, for God's sake. Every time there's a disaster around the world, right? We had stockpiles of corn and stuff like that, and we gave it to people to keep.
The idea, what I'm hearing though,
it's a market-based approach, because people will buy smoked meat.
But don't they do something similar? In that, if a buddy of mine owns a few hundred acres out in Michigan, and when it's hunting season and he gets a tag to get a deer, he hunts on his property. Neighbors say, hey, do you mind if I hunt on your property this weekend? And he'll say yay or nay, depending on what he wants to do. And it's his. And those deer come through, but wildlife experts say we need fewer deer. He helps with that, and he feeds his family with it. Isn't that the same thing?
Sand County had a big project back in Pennsylvania. For 20 years we studied this. So the way a botanist studies the impact of deer on plants is to make a little plot and fence it in and watch what grows here versus watch what grows over there.
I think I've seen these things. All right.
Sand County said that we got to do the opposite. So we got private land, timberland, and state land totaling 75,000 acres, put a fence around it. We went to the local towns and convinced the local hunters that Getting a trophy deer and seeing more deer was not good. Seeing big, healthy deer was much better, and we got them to kill does and fawns before they could ever take a buck. And that lowered the populations in this giant experiment down and down and down, and we watched what happened to the plants so that we knew that at a certain stocking rate of X numbers of deer per square mile, that the forest could recover naturally. And we did this for 20 years, and we presented all this data to the Game and Fish of Pennsylvania. You know what they said? No, stick it. But you know what happened next door? New York State picked it up. And they changed the way you hunt. So you can't just take a trophy deer, you have to take some of the females. The females are the problems. They're the ones that have the babies.
You are giving me a straight line that I am not stupid enough to take. You keep talking about Sand County. Real quickly, I don't remember Sand County, Colorado. What is Sand County? It's the organization you're very involved with. What is it?
Aldo Leopold, when he left Arizona and the U.S. Forest Service, moved back to the Baraboo region of central Wisconsin. And that's where he lived and worked with private landowners. He built his cabin there. He was a published author, not just scientific, but he wrote a lot. And his last book before he died was called The Sand County Almanac. It's a very funny name. When I worked in Africa, people would come up to me and say, "Do you work with the Sand Bushmen? What is the Sand County? Do they live in a county?" There is no Sand County. It's a made-up name. It's an allegory. It's prose poetry. But what he said in that book, the ultimate thing was, that was radical at 1940-something, it was really radical, was that just like humans have a moral relationship with each other, they have a moral relationship with nature. That we come out of nature, we are connected to nature, and we become very disconnected, as you pointed out, rightfully so. And if we get reconnected, we can have a healthier nature along with healthy human beings. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So it's the Sand County Almanac, and therefore the foundation created by Aldo Leopold's godson, Reed Coleman, the son of the guy who founded the chair at University of Wisconsin in ecology. First one in the world.
You also do something through this organization. You give out a prize, the Leopold Aldo Prize.
The Leopold Conservation Award.
All right, and explain this one to me, because I'm not quite getting it. Usually what happens if you want to win an award, you give a lot of money to the organization or to a cause, and then they run around, and some year they give you a banquet and they give you a plaque and they say, "Thank you for all the money you've given us," and you try to sell those tables to the guy's friends. That's what you're doing here, right?
Totally different.
Explain it to me, because I'm still wrapping my mind around this prize.
It is so clever, and it was developed by a ranch wife on the Yampa River near Steamboat Springs, Lynn Sherritt, a brilliant woman, a rancher and a conservationist living on a ranch in Colorado. And she said, if we gave out a prize that was so significant that it got people's attention, and we found people who were not just good conservationists on their ranches, but were also leaders of the communities, whether it was on the school board or in agriculture, didn't matter, but they were leaders, that we would be able to mobilize and change people's thinking. Because ranchers work right across their fence lines. This guy looks at what you're doing, and if you're doing a better job, he wants to know what you're doing. And so it's a community that operates on this.
Is there a friendly competition between ranchers? I mean, I know we're all caring about this.
Sometimes not so friendly.
Really?
Sure, but there is. We're all competitive. We all want to, but economics is the best competition. Because, right? If it drives things in a negative way, then it hurts. But if it drives things in a positive way, then you can actually see improvements on the land. So Sand County Foundation, with the help of Lynn Sherritt, who was with Colorado Cattlemen's, and helped to create the Agricultural Land Trust to protect open lands from development by subdivisions, came up with this award. I gave the first one out in Colorado. I gave the first, I don't know how many out around the country. That was our experiment state because I was the director and Lynn was this brilliant thinker. And lo and behold, 20 years later, there are 175 award winners from California to Maine and from North Dakota to Texas. And it's a fraternity of leadership. It's a fraternity of leadership among private landowners. Let me tell you how it works, though.
Yeah.
We don't pick the winners. Every state has to agree to create an independent board. Anybody can nominate. So if I'm a rancher, I can self-nominate, or my grandmother can nominate me, or some environmental organization can nominate me, but it has to be a very specific, independent evaluation. I lived in part-time in Hawaii for a while. We talked about doing one of these in Hawaii. That would really be more than coast to coast. And the leader of this organization came to me and said, Ed, this is a wonderful award and we know exactly who should get it the first year. And I went back to the foundation and said, let's drop Hawaii. They don't understand what we're after.
Right, so what is it you're trying to invest in then? So years of doing this, years of giving out prize money as well as a title. What is it you've purchased with this investment? So therefore, now you have a fraternity of people who love conservation?
Well, think about 100 landowners who are doing the best conservation, and the average size of their land is 10,000 acres. That's 1 million acres of land that is now being worked on for the benefit of both nature and the people living on the land. They make more money, their grasslands are more healthy, their carbon soils have increased, we have engaged them in everything from inviting people to stay with them and watch the migrations of birds, so you get birders on there. This is all about money. I lecture to environmental kids and I tell them to follow the money. They hate me for it, but it's real. You understand human motivation when you follow the money. Why do you think the Nature Conservancy has bought up so much private land? It's because they have billionaire donors who don't understand that people should stay on the land, and they get this money, hundreds of millions, billions, to buy up land, and then they don't know what to do with it. They give it to government. And government is a poor manager of land. Anybody that lives near government-managed land recognizes this after a while. The beetle kill was not because of climate change. It was bad Forest Service management, bad Bureau of Land management. They did a bugger all job, and their forestry professionals were telling them that Smokey the Bear was the wrong approach, and they didn't care. Management of bureaucracies follows a non-adaptive path over and over again wherever you go. So what happens? Private landowners can't afford to be non-adaptive. They have to be adaptive. That's what the marketplace does for us. So if
they're long-sighted,
right?
If they're in it for 2 years, you could create another Dust Bowl because they're just going to wipe out their land and move on.
And go across the country and interview landowners and find out how long they've been on the land and what their objective is. And you'll always find that it is not to make the most money. You know who forces them off the land? Developers and people who want to raise property taxes, because agricultural taxes are low and subdivision taxes are high.
And inheritance taxes.
And inheritance taxes have killed private landowners.
For those who might not get it, so I've got 1,000 acres, and I've got 10 kids. Well, I'm going to give each one of them 100 acres when I die. Well, that's a transfer of wealth, and if the land's worth that much, they have to pay a lot of money to accept this, or they have to sell off the land in order to pay the death taxes on it.
The left claims that very few people actually have to pay estate taxes, and that's because we're not all stupid. That if you're stuck with estate taxes and your land is going to be destroyed anyhow by being subdivided, And it's going to be appraised by people who want to subdivide it at $4,000 an acre. When as a cattle ranch, it's worth $500 an acre. You are screwed by the tax code, and your children cannot stay on the land.
I'll give you a really personal example of that. I can't golf. I haven't been able to golf for like 25 years. And so Dave Copel that I work with and we go to a place called Haystack a couple times a year. It's buffoonery. It's a 9-hole, beautiful little course owned by a family. And there's big trees, and it's just a nice way to get around and not be embarrassed because you can't play golf. Well, the man who owned it died. His family wanted to keep this property and keep it the way he wanted it, which is very much like what you talked about. He takes care of this land. We all enjoy it. It gets us out. Well, they have to sell it to developers because that's the only way to pay the taxes.
The system is disgusting. So about 15 years ago, during the Middle Eastern wars, Department of Defense wanted to expand its training grounds here in Colorado, an area called Pinyon Canyon and Fort Carson. And Pinyon Canyon has a place where you can play with artillery and tanks and ride around and learn how to have tank battles. And they decided they wanted to get another 1 million acres down in this gorgeous country to the east of the Spanish Peaks, southeastern Colorado. And the ranchers didn't want to sell. And they're very competitive people, but they got together as a community. And they wanted to fight the DOD, and I wanted them to negotiate. I wanted them to sit down as a community and get something worked out where everybody would win and nobody would lose. But in fact, what happened was they had a whistleblower inside of the Department of Defense that showed them emails between the generals that valued their land at next to nothing. The developers were valuing that land out there in the middle of nowhere, $2,000 an acre for things like estate taxes, and the Department of Defense was going to pay $100 an acre. And they got a hold of these things and they made it public. And the poor old Pentagon went home with their tail between their legs. They had been caught at their own game.
Incredible. All right, let's wrap this up. Because what you told us is hard to wrap our brains around because it's counterintuitive to the way we've been indoctrinated. That this environmental movement is the only way to save the planet. That ownership is bad, and if only we could take it all and put it in. I'll give you this one example. So wind energy, solar energy has these huge subsidies, huge subsidies. They wouldn't survive without them. It's ridiculous. And I said, well, I'm not against either one of these things. Just get rid of the subsidies. And I've heard people say, fine, if you get rid of the subsidies for oil and gas. To which I go, fine. Explain to me what the subsidy is. And they say the largest subsidy is that when you do oil and gas development on public lands, the royalty rate that they give to the government is usually a lot less than what they give to a private owner of land. So I'm thinking, wait a second. So the subsidy is that the government doesn't do a good deal when leasing its land to an oil developer. The answer really is simple. Privatize the land. Those owners will charge more for the oil rights, and then you won't be able to say oil is subsidized. I mean, there's other subsidies and those are wrong too, but the best way to take care of it, sell the land. Let private individuals own the land.
You know who came up with this idea?
Me.
Alexander Hamilton.
No, I did it. I told you right now.
I know you're really old. He's not as old as me. At the end of the revolution, all the debt was in the hands of what now became the states. There was no federal government to borrow money. And it was almost worthless. So Alexander Hamilton was a brilliant, if not corrupt man. He had his friends buy up all these notes, and then he bought it back as the first Secretary of the Treasury for $1 on $1. So his friends made fortunes. And then they took all the lands that were called the Ohio Territory, and they sold it to private landowners. The most productive land in the world was public land at the beginning of this country, and it was liquidated into private hands. The Mismeasure America is a book you can read that describes this whole thing. It was corrupt. Senators owned the land companies. Does this sound familiar? When you think the government is corrupt today, just go back to 1800 and see what was going on, and things haven't actually changed all that much. What that accomplished was that all that land was put in private hands, and then the Homestead Act did the same thing. There are people who claim that government land can be as productive as private lands. It's rubbish. It's complete nonsense. So, you're exactly right. The reason that there's still a 12.5% royalty on federal lands, and by the way, it's 18.75% on most state lands because they're a little bit more nimble than the federal government, and the royalty rates in my lifetime have gone on private land from 12.5%. That's why it was fixed that way, a 1/8. On federal lands,
because that's what the feds
that was
did.
what the that was what private landowners were getting,
and so the feds
adopted that.
Got it.
But the feds can't change because they're maladapted, they're unadapted, they're never adaptive managers. And so guess what happens when there's an oil or gas boom? Private landowners are not stupid. All of a sudden they say, I'm not taking your 12.5% royalty on this piece of paper. I'm putting in 15%. I'm putting in 17.5%. I'm putting in 20%. And economics drove that up.
Which means...
And listen, when we put Jonah Gas together, nobody thought there was anything out there. And you nominate... Out in western Wyoming, in Sublette County, Wyoming. Nobody thought there was anything of value. It was a graveyard of failed oil and gas drilling. And so all that land was open. We had to nominate it ourselves, put it up to auction, nobody would bid on it, and we would pay $1 an acre. And those same environmentalists would say, look, the oil companies or gas companies have screwed the public because they got all this land for $1 an acre. Well, guess what? Before I found all that gas, it wasn't even worth $1 an acre. They can take that attitude and hang.
It also would destroy their claim that oil and gas is subsidized, which is great. All I want in energy is for there to be no winners and losers from the government. That I am agnostic. Matter of fact, I will tell you, in the future, solar energy will likely be the power source of the future as technology gets better and better and better, and nanotechnology grows. We're not there yet, but we will, and government doesn't need to
You're preaching to the choir here, John. I know you're doing you're doing this for the show. The truth is, I've been a public speaker for 45 years. I'm an oil and gas guy. I made my fortune in oil and gas, and I have been advocating for nuclear energy, number one, for electricity. Yeah. Number two, when people were saying we're running out of gas, we're running out of oil, we're the peak oil people, I get up and lecture and say we'll leave most of it in the ground. There's more than we can possibly ever use. We should migrate away from it. We should evolve into something else. But let's be straight about the fossil fuel age. Prior to the fossil fuel age, the average lifespan of a human being was 27 years, and it had been that way from hunter-gatherers through the earliest farmers, 27 years. A 13-year-old woman getting pregnant, having a chance to have 6 children, 2 which died before she delivered them, 2 after she delivered, and maybe 2 survived to adulthood. And it was the fossil fuel age and cheap energy of coal and gas and oil that raised our lifespans to almost 80 years.
Not only that,
that's a subsidy that the oil and gas industry has given to humanity, not the other way around.
Furthermore, we live in the most inhospitable places on the planet.
Only because we have this technology that enables us to do that.
Including right here in Denver, Colorado. You know, when you take away energy, where man can flourish are a couple small pockets that are still subject to wild environmental changes. But now you can live in Alaska. That's a pretty amazing thing.
Hey, I want the public to know one more thing, because this really annoys me, about this advocacy kind of approach to anti-whatever. Whether it's oil and gas or ranching or cows, it doesn't really matter to me. I want the public to understand this. Every dollar I made in oil and gas before I ever got the money, 25% of that was removed as taxes and royalties. So if I'm a philanthropist and I give it all away and I pay a really low tax rate, I'm being taxed more than anything else, because philanthropy is a way of avoiding the government having to pay for services, and I'm paying for it voluntarily. And all of my royalty income that I ever received, all my oil and gas income, was taxed before I ever saw it. How would you like to make a buck and have the government take 25% right off the top?
Doesn't that happen to all of us?
Not before we declare our taxes in our tax year.
My withholding.
Well,
they
you
take
do
it
have,
anyway.
But withholding at least has a limitation on it for the amount. Oil and gas doesn't.
No, only for Social Security and FICA.
Right.
The others, they just take it and hold it. And with inflation, the longer they hold our money,
well, not
and
with
they
me.
give it back.
I do quarterly, but then I give them more than they need because otherwise they harass me.
Oh, the problems you must have, my friend.
Well,
the problems.
COVID year.
Yeah, bad year. People want to learn more about this. All right, so this has been and we've just touched on it, but this whole idea is new to a lot of people. Where do they go? What is this? Can they learn from the Sand County Foundation?
SandCountyFoundation.net. All one word, SandCountyFoundation.net. It's a marvelous organization. We sponsor all kinds of programs to help startup farmers, which is really difficult today. Go and try to buy a farm, when you're a poor kid. Minority farming. And you know who did that? It was those Leopold Conservation Award winners on their own as a group got together and said to the foundation who gave them the award, hey, there's something more that we can do to give back. We can help people who are startups because we are experts. It's an amazing little organization.
I'm glad you do it. Let's do this again. This is a lot of fun. Ed Warner, thank you.
Thanks, John.
If you enjoyed that conversation, by all means, click one of these other great programs. We have the best conversations with the most fascinating Coloradans. And subscribe to our channel. Just click down below and hit that little bell button too. You don't want to miss a single show.